Hello, I'm Elaine Farrow from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. You can see my lovely backdrop behind me. Today I'm going to present my short paper, Dialogue Attributes that Inform Depth and Quality of Participation in Course Discussion Forums. This is joint work with my PhD supervisors, Johanna Moore and Dragan Gasovic. And I want to thank my sponsors as well, as you'll see at the bottom of the slide. So first, let me tell you a little bit about course discussion forums. They're widely used in many different types of learning environments, from really large MOOCs and online courses to blended learning and distance learning, but also more and more they're being used for face-to-face classes where the number of questions coming from students is too large to be handled by email. And increasingly, instructors cannot monitor everything that's written in these forums. They can't spot common threads among all the messages that are there. And so our work is looking to identify the depth and quality of participation automatically from these forum messages. This could help direct the attention of instructors to where it's most needed, but analysing the models can also give us new insights into the learning that's taking place. So the question we're addressing in this paper is to look at which dialogue attributes can discriminate between messages in terms of the depth and quality of participation. So we're looking for indicators of the depth and quality of participation, and to do this, we're using two widely used frameworks for assessing critical discourse. The first of these is the Community of Inquiry framework, which was developed specifically to understand online education and social knowledge construction. And the second is the ICAP framework, which has been effective in predicting educational value in a classroom setting as well as online. And I'm going to explain a little more about these two frameworks next. So first, the Community of Inquiry framework. It postulates three presences which are important for the overall educational experience: social presence, teaching presence, and cognitive presence. And cognitive presence is considered the most fundamental of the three. And it's the phases of cognitive presence that we will be using in this work as indicators of depth and quality of participation. So there are four of these phases. First, the triggering event, which is the initial question that sparks the discussion. Then there's the exploration phase, where many new ideas are being considered. Then discussion often will move on to an integration phase, where ideas begin to coalesce into a more coherent form as connections are identified. And finally, there's the resolution phase, where a conclusion has been reached, perhaps in the form of a hypothesis that can be tested. Now, not every discussion will progress smoothly through all of these phases. Things can jump back and forth, but this progression on this slide shows the increasing depth and quality of participation. And of course, some of the messages will display no signs at all of cognitive presence, and they will get the other label. So moving on to the second of the frameworks, the ICAP framework. Here we have four modes of cognitive engagement, and I've arranged them as a pyramid. Each mode builds on the modes below. At the bottom we have passive, which means just sitting and listening to a lecture, for example. So you're just letting the information wash over you. That is a form of learning. It is a form of engagement, but it's the lowest one in the pyramid. What's better is active engagement, which could be something like highlighting sections in a text or taking verbatim notes. So you are actively engaging, but not contributing anything new. The next level up is constructive, where some novel output is being generated, perhaps your own summary notes in the case of a lecture. And the pinnacle of the pyramid is interactive mode, where you're working constructively with someone else. You're building on what has gone before, you're working together. And each of these modes represents a qualitatively different type of learning, a different mode of learning, not just a greater quantity. So in the context of discussion forums, the way these different modes of cognitive engagement work is something like what I have in the table here. So interactive mode refers to messages that display explanation or reasoning about the current topic in response to an earlier message. So that's the part where we're building on what has gone before. Constructive would again be explanation or reasoning, but without that link back to something that someone else has said. And constructive can also just be introducing new content to the discussion. In active mode, the student will reference specific previous content or show other signs of being engaged with the course in general. Passive mode in this context means just reading messages without responding. And once more, we have off-task messages, comments without any relation to the current topic or the course. Comments about what you watched on TV last night or pictures of your cat. And finally, in this piece of work, we have another label that we have added to the framework called affirmation. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that on the next slide. Affirming what was said in an earlier message. So in previous work that built on the ICAP framework, the affirmation messages were treated as a special case. And the label assigned to them depended on the label of the earlier message to which they were responding. So for example, a message that was interactive, if you responded to that by saying thank you or yes, I agree, your response would be labeled constructive. If it was an active message, your response would be labeled active. And there was a specific rule-based process for deciding what label your message of affirmation should get based on what it was responding to. In our work, we felt that a classifier that we want to be generalizable to future data should aim to assign labels based only on the current message, that the same message, the same content should get the same label, regardless of what the previous message had as its label. So only the data itself should be considered when assigning the label here. And so we introduced the affirmation label as a placeholder for this concept. And of course, as I said, there is this rule-based process that could be used to recreate the previous behavior if that was desired. So those are the indicators that we're using in this work. And our methodology was to train predictive classifiers for both of these frameworks, community of inquiry and also ICAP, using the same data set. And then having trained those classifiers, we want to look at them to discover which attributes are the most predictive and how those correlate with the framework labels. So the data set that we used was from a fully online master's level distance learning software engineering course that ran at a Canadian university. We used 4 course offerings in this work, comprising 61 students in total with a median of 14 students per session. So as you can see, it's not a large MOOC scale course, it's a much more small course than that. So the table shows more details about the number of students and the number of messages in each of these sessions. We used the first 3 of the sessions as training data, and we used the final very small session as test data, as held out data, just to validate that our models were managing to generate something that was generalizable to unseen data. So the structure of the messages is as follows. So there was one message thread for each student video presentation. So much like the current conference, the students were asked to present something and then start a message thread where they could discuss what they had presented. The messages themselves were text only. We don't have access to the original videos. So our analysis is based just on these discussion forum messages. We have 1,151 messages in total. The distribution of the messages across the phases of cognitive presence is as shown in the chart at the top there. So you can see that most of the messages were exploration and relatively few got as far as resolution. And this is not unusual. This is what we might expect. Looking at the modes of cognitive engagement from the ICAP framework, we see quite a lot of interactive and constructive messages here. And we see there are no passive messages at all, because passive in the context of discussion forum would mean reading a message without responding. And we didn't have access to the log data to show when people had clicked to read a message without writing something in response. We're only analysing the messages that were actually sent. And again, you'll notice that there's only one off-task message in this particular data set. The students were really motivated here. Contribution to this discussion forum counted towards their grade, so there wasn't much chat. So the attributes that we're looking at to see which ones are predictive, there are 206 of these that we're using, and they're used as the classification features in the predictive models. So we have 91 word counts from the Look tool, which are things like personal pronouns, expressions of positive emotion, discrepancies, number of question marks, and so on. We have 106 metrics from the Cometrics tool, things again like word counts, paragraph length, text coherence and complexity scores, readability scores, and so on. And 9 features relating to the discussion structure. The number of direct replies to a message, the total number of replies, going right down the thread, so including replies to replies, the depth within the thread for each message, its position from the start and from the end of the discussion, and so on. So there are some examples in the slide, but all the details are in the paper. So to train the classifiers, we trained 2 separate predictive classifiers, one for each of the frameworks. We excluded the off-task messages from ICAP because there were so few of them. We trained on the first 3 of the course offerings, and we built 20 random forests of 1,000 trees. We used 10-fold cross-validation repeated 10 times. We rebalanced the classes inside the cross-validation loop in line with best practice. And then we used these results to tune the random forest parameters and build our final model. And then we assessed the performance of that final model, not just on the cross-validation, but also using the 4th of the course offerings as test data. So in terms of predictive performance metrics, we found, we looked at the Cohen's kappa score, and we found that for the phases of cognitive presence from community of inquiry, the cross-validation was 0.421, and on the test data, 0.428. So that indicates a moderate level of agreement. And on ICAP modes of cognitive engagement, we got slightly higher numbers, 0.592 on cross-validation and 0.645 on the test data. And this indicates substantial agreement. So what we're comparing here is the labels assigned by the classifier with the gold standard human labels that were added to the data. So from this we conclude that our classifiers are good enough for us to then go on to the second stage and look at which attributes are the most discriminative. So we do this by analysing variable importance, and we found that a small subset of the features have a high degree of explanatory power. Some of them were predictive for both the frameworks, and others were predictive for one framework, but not for the other. So starting with text metrics, we found that longer messages and fewer question marks were associated with deeper engagement for both frameworks. And this is in line with prior work. The number of words in the message, the number of sentences, and the mean paragraph length for each message all appeared in the top 20 most discriminative attributes for both of the models. The lexical diversity results are a little more complicated. The details are in the paper, but these results are in line with prior work on community of inquiry. Looking at structural attributes, sorry, I think my slide progression's gone slightly wrong. So in terms of structural attributes, the number of replies a message received, both direct replies and indirect replies, was highly predictive for both of the frameworks. And so the highest number of replies was for messages labelled constructive and triggering event, respectively, across the 2 frameworks. This is not surprising because the first message in each thread would tend to get that label. The first message introduces new content. It's not building on what someone else has said, so it's labelled constructive. It's also the triggering event that starts the discussion. Obviously, other messages also get these labels, but that helps to explain that result. Messages that were more deeply nested in the discussion were more likely to come from the other or the resolution phases of cognitive presence, and to indicate affirmation or the interactive mode in ICAP. So once again, just from the definition of the resolution phase, that it comes at the end of the discussion, that it brings together and ties together what's gone before, then this is no surprise that a more deeply nested message is more likely to be a resolution phase message. Also, other messages, message of affirmation in the two different frameworks, these can be things like saying thank you for all your contributions to the discussion, that sort of thing. Again, that tends to come at the end. But also the interactive mode of ICAP, where messages are building on what's gone before, would tend to be more deeply nested. One thing that was slightly surprising was that none of the features we added relating to timestamp order within a thread appeared in the top 20, apart from the first message indicator, which is strongly indicative of triggering events. So I've already mentioned about the first message having this particular characteristic, but nothing else to do with timestamp order actually appeared as being very predictive. So in terms of content, we found that expressions of positive emotion and affective process words were strongly indicative of other messages and affirmation messages. And greater use of discrepancy words, things like could and should, and money words like oh, indicated deeper phases of cognitive presence, but these things were not predictive on the ICAP framework. And the highest value for the attribute that indicates given versus new information in each sentence are seen for interactive messages and were lowest for affirmation messages. So what this attribute captures is that an argument is being developed within the message. So this is what we might expect to see for an interactive message, that it might start by saying, oh, you've said this and you've said that, but I think, and then kind of going on and building on what has been said before. Whereas an affirmation message is likely just to be a thank you and likely to be very short and not have any kind of given versus new development within it. We also found that the use of second person pronouns was strongly indicative of active mode, where quoting, direct quoting is expected, and again of affirmation messages. So moving on to the limitations of our study, only a single data set was used for this preliminary study. That's why it's a short paper. And the first message of every thread in our data set follows a similar format and is labeled in the same way. And this isn't something we would expect to find in some other data set. So the results to do with the first message indicator need to be treated with caution. Off-task messages were too infrequent to be used in this study. Other data sets looking at discussion forums may well find lots of off-task messages, particularly in the current climate, but we didn't have those available to us to analyse. And also the passive mode from the ICAP framework was not used here at all, just because we didn't have access to that data. So our aim here was to identify the dialogue attributes that could be used to discriminate between contributions of varying depth and quality. And our expectation was that the two frameworks we were looking at would provide complementary perspectives. Of course, they'll have some things in common, but they've come from different fields, and part of our ongoing research agenda is to see the different complementary perspectives that they bring. We found that several simple measures of contribution size correlated with deeper engagement in both frameworks, but other correlations were framework specific. And one important thing we found was that the reply-based network structure in the message threads was far more important than chronological order, particularly so for the ICAP model. And so it's really important to preserve that information when extracting discussion forum messages for analysis. So don't just rely on the time order. Take note of which message was a reply to which other message, because that was found to be very important here. So to conclude then, we found unsurprisingly that contribution quantity is highly correlated with participation. But setting a minimum threshold of message length is unlikely to improve learning, and it would harm important social exchanges such as affirmations. Affirmations are really important for moving the conversation along. Community of inquiry does have social presence as a separate concept from cognitive presence, and I haven't looked into that in great detail yet, but if we're looking just at the depth and quality of participation, then telling people you must write at least 3 paragraphs or whatever it might be is not the way to go here. So future research should look beyond contribution quantity to consider which other dialogue attributes might indicate depth and quality of participation, to decouple just pure quantity from the quality, from the things that are more interesting, the things that people can change and that will lead to greater learning. Thank you very much for listening.